Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari presented the 2022 budget on October 7, 2021 to the joint session of the National Assembly, a document which indicates a deficit of 6.25 trillion naira, or approximately 3.39% of GDP. This is slightly above 3% ceiling set by the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007. Of course, the deficit is expected to be financed by new borrowings, privatization proceeds, and drawdown on loans secured for specific projects. Now, look at this. Non-debt recurrent expenditure of 6.8 trillion naira is the largest expense item, which is 60% relating to personnel costs. The personnel cost element is 4.11 trillion. Now, to be joining me today on our guest segment to look through and give us insights into these matters and others arising is no other than Mr. Ben Akabueze, the man who knows and who should know who is in the middle of the whole budget process. Ben Akabueze, Esquire, is the Director General Budget Office of the Federation within the Federal Ministry of Finance, Budgets, and National Planning. He is going to be throwing more of this insight. And of course, we're going to have segments here where we're going to be advertising our numbers for those who are interested in coming up to do adverts. We reach far and near to the nooks and crannies of the globe. Bring on your goods, bring on your services, and ICAN on Air will show it out for you. We'll show a few news montage, and then, of course, our social diary, where we are going to be unveiling a few items in our ICAN calendar. Stay connected. We will soon be back. You are welcome back. Oba Otudeko, First Bank GMD UK AK lose 608.32 million in one day. The former chairman of First Bank, Oba Otudeko, and the group managing director of the bank, Orum Eke, lost a combined 608.2 million in one day at the lender's short position investors. Stakeholders lost 34.10 billion to investors, taking out their investment, causing the total investment in First Bank to plunge by a whopping 7.47%. CBN gives breakdown of over 2 trillion interventions disbursement into the economy. The CBN has provided a breakdown on the various interventions carried out to stimulate the economy. CBN revealed this at its latest monthly update published on its website on Wednesday. Please check that out. Industrialists decries infrastructure deficiency difficulty in accessing forex. Larry Badmus, you must remember the motto spare parts, sir. Larry Badmus Industries Limited has decried continuing inability of manufacturers to access foreign exchange for products. Noting that scarcity for forestry remains a major challenge hindering local production capacity. NISS insurance companies have paid $9 billion in compensation for losses recorded during the harsh EndSARS protests. The Nigerian Insurance Association says insurance companies already paid $9 billion, whooping $9 billion, in claims following destructions recorded during the last year's EndSARS protests in Nigeria, a figure which could rise to $20 billion. The chairman of the Nigerian Insurance Association disclosed this recently. That is Mr. Gani Musa, was disclosed in an interview that he granted to the press recently. Thank you very much. Still stay connected. We are going into and going to be unveiling our guests, the man who should know it all, to come and throw more insights into the budget of 2022. Again, stay there, stay put. We'll be right back. Thank you for joining us on this episode, Mr. Ben Akabueze. You are most welcome.
Thank you, Akin. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ben, you are a man Friday when it comes to budget, so you are in the middle of it. We all know, and it's no more news, that the president presented that budget, and the Minister of Finance gave a breakdown. As the man in the center of it all, just give us a brief insight into this budget, its intended consequences, its unintended consequences, if any, and how government plans to tackle this.
Well, thank you. First of all, I think that the goals of the budget are encapsulated in the title for the 2022 budget. 2022 budget is titled the Budget of Economic Growth and Sustainability, and I believe that kind of summarizes the objectives of the budget. It's intended to drive growth. The economy is still emerging from the COVID-19 induced recession, and so even though growth has picked up significantly in Q2 2021, there's a significant base effect on that, because Q2 last year was in the middle of the lockdown. So we understand that growth is still somewhat fragile, and so there's a need to reinforce that recovery and spur growth, and then of course move on to sustainable growth, and so that's why the budget is titled the Budget of Economic Growth and Sustainability. Then It also intends to drive sustainability in the broader sense of it. And so that's why you see there's some focus on, climate smart, investments in infrastructure and, other, uh, in expenditures intended to support our drive towards sustainability in our environment.
Interesting point, Mr. Ben Akabueze. And I see that you talked about economic growth and sustainability. And I see that emphasis on that rather than like some economists will say development, even though at the end of the day it becomes neither here or there. Why is that emphasis on sustainability instead of development, which of course we know will positively impact people?
Well, I sometimes hear people, or often hear people try and make the distinction, and they say focus on growth rather than economic growth rather than economic development. And to be clear about it, economic growth, simply measures the increase in output of goods and services in an economy during a period, in this case, say a fiscal year. Whereas, economic development measures, improvements in the quality of life, of the people and their living standards. For example, measures like, literacy improvements, life expectancy, and such like. However, the reality is you cannot get to economic development without economic growth. So ultimately, economic growth is a path to development. You've got to have sustained economic growth before you can achieve economic development. And that's part of the challenge why we have not, achieved economic development, because we have not achieved sustained economic growth at levels where they're sufficient to drive economic development.
Yes,
over the last decade, our average economic growth rate has lagged behind our population growth rate.
True that.
Despite
Yes.
that, that's why it will not look like there is growth to people.
So it has to be sustained, say, in the short term, 5 years, and then we can then be talking of development, all-inclusive development. But Mr. Ben Akabueze, can we go down and drill a little and do some comparatives? In 2021, the budget was 14.57 trillion. In 2022, it's 16.39 trillion. Give us your insights. What are the key issues which accounted for this 12.5% difference?
Well, first of all, okay, there is the factor, and oftentimes we don't talk about this enough to avoid confusing people. But this is an ICAN platform, people who are accustomed to numbers. So the first thing you want to do is equalize the two. So the 2022 budget takes our drive towards fiscal comprehensiveness one step further. So the budget for TED fund, which used to be excluded from the federal government's budget, has from 2022 been brought into the budget. Okay, and so that's 306 billion naira, which, if the 2022 budget was prepared exactly on the same basis as 2021, 2022 will be 306 billion naira less. So you will have less than your 12.5%. That's one. Number two is on an inflation adjusted basis. it's not that, there isn't a significant growth. But also significant is the fact that the 2021 budget was based on an exchange rate of 360 naira to the dollar. The 2022 budget is based on an exchange rate of 410 naira 25 kobo. So your revenues and expenditures that are denominated in dollars, even if they were the same amount in 2022 as in 2021, will automatically, by virtue of the exchange rate differential, increase by a factor of that's 50. So that's that gives you about 17% increase, okay, or more like 14% increase just on that basis. But then it's only a component of the budget that is. So you need to sterilize the impact of these two factors before you then actually determine whether indeed this is a significantly larger budget. From our own perspective, we do not consider it a significantly larger budget. For one thing, the country needs to be spending a lot more money. Our budgets need to be far larger than they currently are.
Interesting point.
So I get, I'm a bit surprised when I hear people freaking out about, so much money, whatever thing spent. Our public expenditure ratio to GDP is one of the lowest on the continent, probably just higher than that of Sudan or some whatever like that, or Somalia, one of those
for sure. For sure.
Our problem is not that we're spending too much money, but rather we're spending too little money. And that's also part of why there's a challenge with economic development. That's part of why there's a challenge with meeting the yearnings of people for infrastructure, for public goods and services.
Okay.
The question, however, is why are we spending too little? We're spending too little also because we are generating too little public sector revenue.
Exactly.
Our public sector revenue to GDP ratio is only higher than that of Sudan on the continent of Africa. And it's about the lowest in the entire world. So there is a correlation. And again, so people say, you're borrowing too much. The truth is, imagine, even with the level of borrowing, how low our public expenditure still is. If we were to cut back on borrowing and spend only our revenues, the truth is we will not be able to, serve the public.
Yes.
Basically, we will have zero capital expenditure, because the reality now is that all our entire capital expenditure is funded by debt, because our recurrent revenues are hardly adequate to cover recurrent expenditures.
We are going to get into that, Pastor Ben. We're going to get.
So really, and I'd like to frame this discussion so that we spend the time, discussing the real issue, which I find is often lost. The real issue is, how do we drive up public sector revenues? And of course, taking into account matters of, accountability and efficiency even of spending that. But without, shoring up our public sector revenues, one, it will be yes, either to then not have to run a deficit budget, but then there's only so long that we can run a deficit budget. Indeed, we're getting to that point where we cannot continue at the pace that we have done in the last several years. And there must therefore be a significant, change in
the profile.
revenues, in revenues accruing to government.
Now, Ben, I hope you can hear me. Yakubu Mutari is just picking that up and says our challenge over the years is the low budget performance for capital expenditure. Right. He's asking me to ask you that the 2021 budget performance for capital expenditure, what could it have been? And what efforts are being made by the federal government to ensure better performance in 2022 and outer years?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if Tari has kept pace with recent developments in terms of our budget. In 2020, for the first time in a long time, we achieved 100% performance of the budget. And so our capital expenditure was, fully spent. In 2021, as of August, we were running at a rate of about 63% of capital expenditure budget. But we are committed, to fully fund the capital budget before the end of the year. And recently, you may be aware that we raised $4 billion on the Eurobond market. That money is going to go towards supporting the capital, budget, performance for the year.
Interesting point there, Mr. Ben Akabueze. But let me drag you back just a little, and I wanted to ask you, how has a possible physical impact of the PIA, I'm talking about Petroleum Industry Act, been captured in this 2022 budget, since the implementation is going to commence that year, 2022?
The 2022 budget is based on what we call the hybrid model, where the first 6 months of the year is based on the pre-PIA model, the fiscal model, and the second half of the year, July to December, is based on a post-PIA fiscal model.
I see.
And that is one of the reasons why we had to, amend, because by the time we prepared the first, medium-term fiscal framework, which was sent to the National Assembly for approval, the PIA had not been passed into law.
True that.
To the PIA being passed into law, we had to go back to the drawing board and, put through the impact of this, and then, based on this model, and that's one of the reasons we had to go back to the National Assembly with a revised medium-term fiscal framework.
Super. Interesting point. People will argue here and there, but Kunle Akiode is asking this question, that how much can we justify the ratio of capital to recurrent expenditure in this our discourse?
Well, first of all, up until 2016, the federal government had no policy, at least that we're aware of, in terms of how much of its budget was going to be spent on capital. So with effect from the 2017 budget, we introduced a minimum 30% ratio. In the decade prior to that, the capital expenditure ratio was significantly less than 30%. We set ourselves a minimum again of 30% from that 2017 going forward. We haven't always met it. In 2020, for instance, we didn't, because when COVID-19 hit, we had to revise our budget. We had to cut back on, capital expenditure. We had to spend more to deal with the challenge of COVID-19. A lot of that expenditure was recurrent and all of that. So, but for 2022, the 2022 budget has capital expenditure coming in at 32%. Is that, high enough? Maybe not. We would like to, keep that higher. But the point is, that's only possible now because your recurrent expenditure is largely covered. Okay. Any incremental revenues that you generate and incremental budgetary resources now would go towards capital expenditure and drive up your capital expenditure ratio. Having said that, let me make this point because there's a tendency in the minds of people to simply draw the line between capital and recurrent expenditure. And in the minds of many people, capital expenditure is always good and recurrent expenditure is bad. But that's not how it works. In public finance, it cuts differently. There's a concept of good recurrent expenditure and bad recurrent expenditure. Bad recurrent expenditure is wasteful, avoidable expenditure. But the bulk of your expenditures in area like health care will come in as recurrent. If you look at the healthcare budget, on the balance, the recurrent portion of the healthcare budget, which includes the salaries of the doctors, the cost of running the hospitals and all of that, the consumables and all of that will come in as recurrent expenditure. And typically, there will be 3 times the capital expenditure for the sector. But guess what? A naira of recurrent expenditure in health, properly spent, empirically proven by, studies and analysis globally, and you can check that out, delivers a higher return on investment to a country than as much as maybe 4 naira spent on road infrastructure or whatever. So we need to move away from this simplistic analysis that simply assumes that recurrent expenditure is bad and capital expenditure is. If we spend money buying motor vehicles, it will be classified as capital expenditure. But then, that's the category of expenditure we call administrative capital. If we spend money building office, new spanky offices and whatever, it will show up as capital expenditure. Is that better expenditure than expenditure on education, for instance? Empirical studies again. 1 naira spent on, 1 naira spent on girl child education in these parts can deliver more than 10 times the return that you get for 1 naira spent on building some road or doing some something you call capital expenditure. So we need to to basically move away from the simplistic analysis, look at the recurrent expenditure, unpack it. What is it, rather than just take the top line numbers and calculate ratios and make comments. Akin, I've lost. Okay.
Okay. It's coming back to ask, that the revenue performance for 2021, even by your admission, has not been stellar. Now, what measures is the government going to put in place to avert revenue deficit in 2022? Forgetting not that our revenue base keeps on being low year on year.
Well, for 2021, as of August, our revenue performance vis-a-vis the budget on a pro rata basis was running at 73%.
Interesting point.
Whereas our expenditure was, running at excuse me, was running at 86%.
Mm.
And so expenditure is running ahead of budget. And so understandably, our deficit as of August was running ahead of the target by 300 billion naira instead of about 4.3 trillion. We already at 4.6 billion. But usually towards the end of the year, there is usually a pickup in revenues. And so we think that we are going to end up with a better revenue performance than the year-to-date position is showing. But then we also don't think that we're going to have so much more revenues that we will be able to cut back on the projected deficit. In terms of the revenue performance for 2021, again, you need to unpack it. As of August, our non-oil revenues are performing significantly above target. As of August, our company's income tax was 20% ahead of target. Our value-added tax was 38% ahead of target. Customs duty was less than 2% under target. Our independent revenues, principally the remittances from government-owned enterprises, was running at 98% of target. Where we had the big drag as of August this year is oil revenues. Oil revenues as of August were under 50% of target. And why is that? The principal reasons are, one, our oil production as of August was averaging under just over 1.6 million barrels per day, whereas the budget was based on 1.86 million barrels per day. So you're 200,000 barrels per day short if you extrapolate the impact of that over 8 months.
Yeah, in terms of production, in terms of plats, what influenced it? Rise and fall of
in terms of that, as of August, we have achieved an average price of over $65 per barrel, as against $45 that the budget was based on. But
interesting.
We have also seen significant increases in costs of securing the pipelines, maintaining pipelines, but most importantly, the cost of the fuel subsidy, which was not budgeted for, because as of the time we did the 2021 fiscal framework, the government policy was that the subsidy on petrol was no more. Unfortunately, as the combination of rapid rise in crude oil prices and the depreciation of the naira led to a situation where the pump price of petrol would have seen significant increase. For instance, the latest number from the NNPC says that there's 102 naira per barrel subsidy. They're saying on a full cost recovery basis, they need the price of the 264 naira per liter. Against 162 naira that you have currently. This was not budgeted for, but this is being treated by NNPC as a cost under recovery, which is netted out of revenues, oil revenues before remittances to the federation account. So oil revenue is actually the source of the drag in revenues this year. And
I get that.
We'll be closer to our revenue target for 2021.
I get that. So quite a number of uncontrollables that we need to, and from all your explanations, which is quite educative, we need to put things on even meal. Now, we are going to go on a short break, and I like our listeners and our viewers to please keep on sending your questions. We are going to be back very shortly with our guests. Ben Akabueze, thank you. We'll be back with you soon, shortly. You are welcome back, ICAN on Air. Thank you for staying connected. In the first half, we've been fielding questions to Mr. Ben Akabueze. The man in the center of it all has been giving us expatiation, analysis into how sustainability over a period of time will lead to development. But I'd like to quickly ask you, Pastor Ben Akabueze, I know that President Muhammadu Buhari made an allusion to a soon-to-be-launched National Development Plan 2021-2025. How is this different from the MTEF that we've been discussing? Is the nation going back to the days of development planning?
Oh, the nation has been back to the days of development planning since, I mean, for a while now. I mean, in 2017, we launched the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, which was a medium-term plan, in a 4-year medium-term plan. Now, the National Development Plan 2021 to 2025 is a 5-year medium-term plan, but which, again, is sitting within the context of a longer-term vision. Remember, 2020, vision 2020 lapsed in 2020.
Correct.
So, government is crafting a new 30-year vision. 2021, to 2050. Okay. So, and within that, vision, there will be a series of, a series of medium-term development plans, beginning with the 2021 to 2025. The 2021 to 2025 plan is pretty much done. It's in the last stages of consultations with different, stakeholders, before its launch. But the fiscal, the framework of that, plan is, substantially what forms the basis for the 2022 budget. And then the medium-term expenditure framework,
Right.
It's a 3-year rolling, framework. It's, the medium-term expenditure framework is essentially just, a top-down estimation of government, of resources that are going to be available to the government over the the medium term, 3 years, and it's prepared on a 3-year rolling basis. So you have it's a requirement of the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2007. So, for instance, we have now this year we have the 2021 to 2023 medium-term expenditure framework.
Correct.
Then, towards the 2022 budget, we have the 2022 to 2024 medium-term expenditure framework. So it captures 2 years of this one at each time, and then one outer year on a rolling basis like that. Okay. It's essentially a top, a high level estimation of your resources and your expenditures over the medium term, and therefore a projection of your fiscal, your fiscal viability over that medium term, which then leads to, that's why the Fiscal Responsibility Act requires us to submit a medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper. So based on the picture that this medium-term framework shows, you've got to have a fiscal strategy that addresses whatever fiscal issues that that are evident from that medium-term framework. And every year you need to submit this on a 3-year rolling basis. So it is not inconsistent with development planning. Some countries have totally jettisoned development planning for this medium-term expenditure framework approach, but we think that you can combine both. Okay. So that when you have development planning, at least it provides a context. It sets for even your plans over those things. And again, because as I said, the medium-term development plan again has to sit within the overall ecosystem of your vision, and in this case now Nigeria Vision 2050, the 30-year vision, which is being
Point well made. Thank you very much, Mr. Ben Akabueze. I have this question that I also like to ask you, being somebody who's been in oil and gas for quite a while myself. The CBN governor was quoted as saying that 40% of our FX demand, which has no significant impact take the masses, is on fuel importation, going back to this petroleum subsidy issue. Now, we have spent about 800 billion to date on fuel subsidy, estimatedly. What's our plan to get out of this crisis?
Well, I think that ultimately the plan will have to be a plan of Nigerians, not of government. Nigerians will have to agree collectively that this fuel subsidy does does not do the majority of Nigerians any good. First of all, let's understand when we talk about fuel subsidy, we're talking about subsidy on petrol, PMS.
Yes.
Because kerosene, which is the fuel that the poor use to cook, kerosene is deregulated.
And diesel.
Diesel, which is the fuel that powers even industries, in the face of our power shortages and whatever, and which fuels, the mass transit vehicles and the trucks that move our goods across the country, is deregulated. But we have become fixated on PMS, on petrol subsidy. Empirical studies show that the bulk of this petrol subsidy, at least 85% of it, does not go to the poor. It goes to the rich and those who do not need it, like you and I. Even if you don't admit it, you don't need the subsidy. Need it.
Ben, I just nodded my head.
Everybody can use extra cash in their pocket, but I mean, truthfully speaking, we can do without it. But there's a lie that has been sold to the poor masses, and which unfortunately has become gospel to labor, that petrol subsidy must not go. In March 2020, when COVID-19 hit and crude oil prices fell, collapsed,
crashed, yes,
it provided a window for us to exit petrol subsidy. And the immediate impact, before then, the price of petrol was 145 naira per liter. That provided us a window. The price of petrol came down to 123 naira per liter.
But Ben, is that not that there was no political? But I was just going to intervene and say, was that there was no political will at that time to get to that window?
I don't know what you mean by political will, but just hear me out about what happened. Just hear me out about what happened. First of all, there is an agency of government, PPPRA, which existed until just this last week when it was that has, by law, the power to fix, to set the template for pricing, petroleum products. Okay.
Very well.
You might say that our own is a guided, deregulation. There's a template that guides whatever, that makes sure everybody can cover their costs and there's reasonable margin and avoids, profiteering and whatever. But that template, based on that, prices where this young government said, so be it. And prices fell below 120, 145 and stayed there for a while. But as soon as the interplay, the two major factors that drive the price of, products at the pump stations here, because sadly, for several years now, we import all our petroleum products. The two key factors are crude oil price and exchange rate. So when there was a faster than projected recovery in crude oil prices following COVID-19, and then exchange rate appreciation, the moment we crossed 145, the pre-COVID price, labor and civil society started, threatening. And, by the time it got to 162, they were calling out the place in this thing there. In the middle of COVID-19 and all of that, it was, a labor, whatever crisis that would disrupt healthcare and all of that was thought to be, a catastrophic, prospect for government. And so government elected to direct PPPRA to suspend further adjustments of the price while it engages with labor. That engagement has continued with labor, labor still has not accepted the rationale for, to fully let the prices go.
Something, Pastor Ben, something similar to Pontius Pilate saying that my hands are tied. But look, I won't allow this to go. One of the matters arising from discourse that I've had personally is that the federal government declined to take recognizance of the current impasse over VAT. Now, if the Supreme Court rules against federal government of Nigeria, ceteris paribus, how will the physical projections be achieved? Just give us your insights.
Well, the irony is that if the federal government, if we were to factor in the impact of the ruling on VAT, it is actually positive for the federal government. The federal government's objection to the ruling on VAT has nothing to do with the federal government. It's about just ensuring, some, fiscal sustainability among some of the states that would otherwise face near collapse. For the federal government, the current ruling that says, basically the current ruling says you keep what you collect. The Federal Capital Territory is only second to Lagos in terms of collection of VAT. The Federal Capital Territory accounts for 20% of VAT collections. Currently, so if you were to, go by the ruling of the court, then the Federal Capital Territory will keep the 20% of the VAT that it collects. Currently, based on the VAT sharing formula, the federal government, including the Federal Capital Territory, only gets 15% of VAT. So just by virtue of what the Federal Capital Territory alone collects, the federal government would have more than it currently gets. Secondly, 25% of VAT collected currently is import VAT. Under the Constitution, foreign trade is something in the terrain of the federal government and whatever. And so it is arguable, that in that event, the federal government will be able to push through a case that, VAT collected on imports. Remember, if in strict application of VAT, you will have no basis to be collecting VAT on import duties, because at that level, what is the value added? The value added is the service of, the service of processing the goods for clearance and whatever. So if the federal government could then well push and argue that the 25% of VAT that it collects on import, as a charge on import duty, belongs to it. In which case, instead of getting 15% of the aggregate VAT pool, the federal government could well end up with 45% of the VAT pool. But the
Now,
bit
Pastor
that is
Ben,
even not debatable at all is that of the
you have buried the point. I mean, we win the war and lose the battle, as the case might be. Unfortunately, time is not our friend. We must wind up. More and more questions are coming, and I'd like to just wind up by letting us have your final words. Your final words on this discourse. 2022 budget. Let's have your final words, your final take.
Well, the 2022 budget envisages aggregate expenditure of 16.39 trillion and revenues of 10.1 trillion. So you have a deficit of 6.26 trillion naira. Significant. Okay. And so it is critical, it's absolutely critical that we meet or surpass that revenue projection. Government
Excellent.
has been mindful of the impact of taxation on growth at a time when you're trying to drive growth. It's not a time to raise tax rates or to introduce new taxes. And so government, despite the revenue pressures has not gone that direction. However, we must do something about, collection efficiency.
The
compliance rate on taxation is still extremely low. For 2020, we did a study on VAT, for instance. On VAT, our estimate of VAT, of VAT not collected in
2020. So I mean, at the end of the day,
it's over 4 trillion naira.
At the end of the day,
that amount, 3.4 trillion of it is due to non-compliance, where people are either not remitting the VAT that they've deducted, or they are not deducting where they should have deducted.
Point made, Mr. Ben Akabueze, and I know we could go on and on.
Need to be at the forefront of driving this tax
I know we can go on and on. Unfortunately, time has not been our friend. I want to thank you, Mr. Ben Akabueze, for availing us your time and for taking the pains to explain in details elements of this budget and how they affect our economy, and going forward, that there's a silver lining out there. We are going to be calling on you more and more frequently, and I'm very sure you are going to avail us. So our guests who are seeing us in the clear, I want to thank you all for being great participants. Next week on Tuesday, we are going to be having another guest, Dr. Greg Ezelo, who will be examining data protection and cybersecurity, its impact in businesses. You want to stay and make sure you are part of all that. And I always say, be the change that you like to see. I remain yours, Akin Fatunke, ICAN on Air. Bye for now.
There must be a wealth shift by unlocking the potential of the youth. We must not see the youth as risk. We must see the youth as assets.